as Sean Deveney writes over at Sporting News, 6 ways to try to close the gap on this thing and make it more interesting. And like I said, what is closing the gap, Sean? They went 16-1. I joked, is it like going 14-3 next year in the playoffs? Is that closing the gap or what? Because that's what it seems like it would be with the way this team's steamrolling people.
Yeah, you gotta take baby steps, right? I mean, one thing at a time.
If they lost 2 more times next year, that would be a big change. But I want to get your opinion on. Right, I want to get your opinion on what Silver said. Stop complaining about the super teams and make your teams better. But I would contend there's simply not enough talent in the league to have 6 or 7 teams that would be comparable to Cleveland and Golden State, unless you want 7 teams that are good and 23 teams that are just downright awful.
Yeah, and you can go back and you can find all sorts of things that Silver has said about all this that have been contradictory. I mean, I remember at Summer League last year, he was talking about the Warriors, and I had written that this might turn out to be good for the league because it gives everybody a sort of a villain to focus on, and sometimes that's beneficial. I think I was wrong on that. I think it turned out certainly with what we saw in the overall ratings for the playoffs, that it did hurt the league. But Silver at that time said, no, this is bad for the league. He said, we don't want this. This is not something that we want to see. And now he comes out and says, well, stop complaining about it. Well, it was something that you said a year ago you didn't like. So, which is it? And I think that this sort of thing has some tied in knots. It was something that the league very much tried to prevent, first of all, in the collective bargaining agreement, and then secondly, don't forget that when they had the TV deal, the new TV deal, and that's really what's at fault here, the new TV deal, he tried to have it smoothed, as they called it, so that there was a gradual increase in the cap, which would have prevented something like Durant going to the Warriors. So, for him to say, stop complaining about it, well, he was complaining about it probably before anybody else.
All right, a couple things. I want to kind of you have 6 ways, and the first team is Cleveland because they would be the closest. The problem with Cleveland, to many, is they are capped out beyond belief, luxury tax problems. How do they close the gap with the current situation they are in?
Well, I think you have to look at the last 3 games of the series and say that, Cleveland was right there in all 3. So obviously the first 2, they just got their doors blown off. Game 3, they probably should have won. And Game 4, that was when they came out like gangbusters and did win. But the thing that and you can talk about trading Kevin Love and all the different things that the pie in the sky stuff, but that's not going to happen. Realistically, the things they can do, to me, the most important thing is find a defensive player who can handle LeBron James for 20 minutes a night. And, that's something, I'm sorry, not James, but Kevin Durant, because LeBron was doing that during the finals, and it was wearing him out. It was obvious, as good as he was offensively, he had to be just as good defensively, and it was tough to do that. That's not his strength. So I think the guy that I wrote about was Tony Allen. I think that's a perfect example of the kind of guy who maybe they could convince to come and sign a cheap contract, who could actually go out and handle LeBron James, not shut him down. I'm sorry, Kevin Durant, and not shut him down, but at least make him work a little harder and at least take some of the pressure off LeBron so that he's not always out there having to play both ways at such a high level.
You added P.J. Tucker. I thought he was another interesting name. That was number 1 that Sean wrote at Sporting News. Cavaliers signed Tony Allen and P.J. Tucker, and a lot of people would say, well, how is that close?
And for the same reason. And look, I'm not saying that that's going to make the Cavaliers beat the Warriors, but if you can throw P.J. Tucker and Tony Allen
right.
at LeBron, I keep saying that at Kevin Durant, rather than having LeBron continually guard him and then have Richard Jefferson off the bench, he killed Richard Jefferson every time he checked in. So, I think that would at least close the gap. Maybe not be enough to get him over the hump, but at least it would serve to make things more interesting.
By the way, I added that caveat before you came on. I said, this isn't 6 ways to beat the Warriors. These are 6 ways to close the gap. And as we joked, 14-3 would be closing the gap on that team. All right, number 2, a lot of whispers about this. Chris Paul leaving the Clippers, Spurs Spurs. We've had former players. Mark Jackson came on with us last week, not the Golden State coach, the former Sixer, and said, look, Chris Paul's the president of the Players Association. It's going to be hard for him to tell the Players Association, I'm taking $50 million less to go bolt to San Antonio. But is that would be a way to close the gap?
Yeah, and I actually absolutely agree with Mark on that. I don't foresee Chris Paul leaving the Clippers, and so I'll start with that caveat. But if you look at what the Spurs potentially could do, should Manu officially retire and they're able to create the cap space, they get rid of Pau Gasol, then that's something that's there for them. And if they were able to pull that off, and I just think there's too many hurdles between here and there for that to actually happen. But if they're able to pull that off, then you'd have to give them a chance, because you can really attack Golden State in the pick and roll, and that's what Chris Paul excels at. That's what LaMarcus Aldridge is really good at. And if you get them in those situations, you've got Kawhi Leonard there. That's something that you could possibly see that being a challenge for Golden State. I think that bench on the Spurs, they've got a lot of young guys. If those guys develop, I think you have a chance to at least give the Warriors a challenge.
Does that really close the gap, though? Can the Spurs beat them with Paul and Kawhi? Is that enough?
Yeah, it puts them in the arena. I'm not sure that they can beat them with that. I think a lot of it would depend on how those young guys on the bench, like I say, Jonathan Simmons, Kyle Anderson, some of those guys who, had some pretty nice postseason production, but are going to have to carry that into the future here. If they can do that, then yeah, I would give them a chance at least to beat the Warriors. No question, the Warriors would be favored, though.
We're talking with Sean Deveney and talking about lots of whispers about OKC, maybe sending Chris Paul to OKC, maybe to Boston.
No, Blake Griffin.
Blake Griffin to OKC or maybe to Boston.
Yeah.
Blake Griffin, by the way, I'm moving down. Rockets signed Blake Griffin is your third piece in this article. Lots of whispers about him to OKC or maybe Boston. What if he went to those Houston Rockets, though?
Yeah, I think that would probably be the ideal landing. Look, Boston is focused on Gordon Hayward, and that's where he's that's where the Celtics' preference is. They would like to reunite Brad Stevens and Gordon Hayward, so that's going to be their priority, and Blake Griffin runs second. Obviously, Oklahoma City would love to have him there just because of his roots in that city. I don't think that necessarily makes them a contender or anybody who's going to threaten. But there's no question that Houston is going to pursue him. They'll also pursue Chris Paul. I should mention that as well. But I think that getting Blake Griffin, when you look at what Houston was lacking, I think that would be perfect for them. If you think of the old Mike D'Antoni teams with Steve Nash, when they got stopped on that 7 seconds or less, when they weren't able to score in that first 7 seconds, what did they do? They went into pick and roll with Amari Stoudemire, and usually it was Stoudemire who had the possession. And I think that Griffin can play that role very, very well, probably better than Stoudemire did even for that Houston team. So I think Houston would be pretty formidable, especially matching up with the Warriors in that situation.
That'd be an interesting one because they score a lot. So it's been brought up on our show a lot that maybe they don't need because you would contend that maybe they're 2 players short, but their style. Maybe they only need like 1.5 players. Like they don't need that third mega piece because of the way they can score.
Yeah, that's right. And when you look at the guys that they have coming off their bench, if they keep everything together, they'll probably lose Lou Williams. But if they keep Anderson and Gordon and guys like that, then I think they'd be in a position where they could certainly at least throw a lot of bodies at Golden State, make them work really hard, and at least make that a pretty good series.
All right, let's go to the next contender, Boston. They're very intriguing, and you say, hey, close the gap, sign Gordon Hayward, and then, of course, keep that draft pick. Don't trade the draft pick and take Markelle Fultz.
I think that's their best course of action. Look, if you make that trade, if you make a trade for Jimmy Butler or somebody like that, then I think you're going to set yourself up for the situation that you worried about with the Warriors, where who's going to be the alpha dog and who's going to be willing to sacrifice. I don't think that a guy like Jimmy Butler is willing to sacrifice, not from what I've seen. So I just think that you take the pick and you take the chance on the number one guy coming out of the draft and the guy that generally is assumed to be number one. I know that there's a possibility they'll take Josh Jackson, but I think you wind up taking Fultz. You bring him off the bench. If he can be anything close to what people think that he can be pretty quickly, combine that with Jaylen Brown, and we've talked about this before, guys, that they're very high on Jaylen Brown. If you watched him at all, you can see why. They have some pieces that could really come together pretty quickly and be pretty dangerous pretty fast. So I think that's certainly a realistic possibility that the Celtics could come together and certainly challenge the Cavs and then perhaps at least give the Warriors an interesting series in the finals.
All right. We're talking with Sean Deveney of the Sporting News, longtime NBA writer. He's got 6 ways to try to close the gap on the Golden State Warriors. Let's look at this one here. Carmelo Anthony, we know no trade. New York, does he want to leave there? You've got the Clippers landing Carmelo. Now, Blake would be gone under possibly your scenario here, but Carmelo going to the Clippers, closing the gap in the West to the Warriors.
Well, yeah, I'm presuming that Griffin does stay in that scenario. So if you have a situation where you lose J.J. Redick and you're able to bring in Carmelo Anthony, you're able to keep Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre Jordan, then that at least gives the Clippers a chance. If I think, and this is something that I mentioned, if Carmelo is able to recognize what his best role is right now, which is a scorer off the bench for a team like that. If you want to be a contender, if you're Carmelo Anthony, you've got to realize that the game has sort of passed you by. That your style of isolation play is not there anymore. That's not how people play anymore. He's got to be more of the guy that we see in the Olympics, who's more of a facilitator, more of a 4 than a 3. And coming off the bench, a guy like that, I think he would be fantastic, and I think he would be a weapon that a lot of teams would have a lot of trouble matching up with. So if that all that were happening, that's a lot of ifs. I understand, but I'm desperately seeking ways for teams to challenge the Warriors, and I just think that is a possibility that could happen. That's the one that I have the least amount of confidence in. But hey, look, it's something that if it came together the right way, it could be a decent lineup.
Sean, is there any way the Cavs could somehow get their hands on Melo? Is there a deal to be made between the Cavaliers and the Knicks?
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, if they didn't have to give up Kevin Love, then certainly that's something they would have to look at, and I think that's a long shot. But because I think the Knicks still want to get something for this guy, but they would have to basically give up, the likes of Channing Frye and contracts like that, a bunch of poor contracts, and basically make the Knicks accept that they're just dumping Carmelo Anthony. And at this point, maybe the Knicks would be willing to do that. Certainly, if they can't get anything sizable in return, then that would be something that they'd have to consider. But yeah, I think that's a little bit of a long shot. And again, part of the calculus there is that you're going to get Carmelo Anthony to agree to be a sixth man, to agree to play that role, and we haven't quite seen him be willing to accept that sort of thing yet.
All right, the 5 scenarios that Sean brought up previous were 5 teams that were all contenders this year. Number 6 has a team that has been embarrassingly bad for 3 years, but it's the Sixers that you include on this list. Now, I know you, Pete, you're a proponent of Kyle Lowry coming to Philadelphia.
I am. I've debated you and Josh on that here in studio.
I've been a little wishy-washy
on that. I thought he'd be a good fit.
Yeah, and so does Sean. He thinks Lowry, and he adds another name that we've discussed, J.J. Redick. And, of course, the caveat with the Sixers is health. But that how's that closing the gap here? Are the Sixers in the mix all of a sudden?
Well, I think you have to, again, and I think I mentioned this, that it would probably take a year. And we're probably not talking about this year in that scenario, but we're probably talking next year. But at the very least, I think that has the potential. And I would say that I'm not a fan of Kyle Lowry to Philadelphia. I think that there's too much risk there with his age and the injuries and all that possibility. But if you did that, if you brought in Lowry and Redick, you had Ben Simmons be what everybody thinks he can be, and then you have a healthy season from Embiid. That's a pretty tough rotation right there, and that's a lot of ifs again. But I think that that's a team that would certainly scare everybody in the East, and possibly even scare the top team in the West.
Yeah, if you look at the East, it almost seems like where Cleveland is now. How many strong years do you think Cleveland still has dominating the top of the Eastern Conference? Or do you think that gap is closer to getting smaller than the championship gap to the Warriors?
I think it's certainly that the Cavaliers are more vulnerable. They don't have the same depth that the Warriors have. You talk about a guy like obviously you start with Durant and Curry, but you talk about a guy like Draymond Green and everything that he does for them, and the fact that he's 27 years old, it's just really hard to see how they're going to come down off of being a 60-win team and always being a contender over the next 4 years or so. That's just something that seems like they're going to be there a long time. Whereas the Cavaliers, as these guys age, as they worry more and more about the luxury tax, you could see Cleveland sort of coming back to earth quicker than Golden State.
Okay, you're going to be totally unprepared for this question, but we threw this out on Tuesday's show, and I'd like to just kind of get a reaction from you on how many teams estimated if LeBron simply was on their team would be in the finals in the Eastern Conference or challenge the Warriors in the West. If LeBron simply left Cleveland and went to that team, they would be in the finals simply because LeBron's on their team.
A quick estimate would probably put me at, I would say at least 15.
Right.
I would say at least 15 teams.
Like in the East, you have almost every team other than like Brooklyn and maybe Orlando, and I guess Philadelphia would be depending on their health.
Charlotte. I don't think Charlotte. There's a couple others, but I would say that there's plenty. And then obviously the West is a little tougher. But you can go all the way down. So maybe I underestimate. Maybe it's more like 18, 19, because Denver. Think about Denver with the talent that they have, and they didn't make the playoffs, but put LeBron on that team and forget it. That's an excellent group.
You got Portland would be interesting. Portland would be interesting, right?
Yeah, Portland. Even New Orleans, Minnesota. Imagine Minnesota with. Boy, that's a great question because I think. My instinct was 15, and I thought, boy, that's a lot. But now that I think about it, it might be more like 20.
Well, I'll let you have fun with that over the weekend.
Yeah, chew on that.
I'll think of that as I'm going to sleep this evening. I tell you that.
Sean Deveney, Sporting News NBA writer here on the Bash. Thanks, Sean. Have a good weekend, pal.
All right, guys. Thank you.